everybody, I think that the regulatory academic 5 minutes have passed. In some countries, it's 15 minutes, some 20. We try and keep it to 5. So I think we can get started. Welcome to this session in which we are extremely privileged to have with us Dr. Guha-Sapir to talk to us about disaster preparedness, disaster management, disasters indeed themselves. What are disasters? I think we know a few things about disasters in Emilia-Romagna recently, with the dreadful floods there have been, and people in Florida, not to mention, well, Bangladesh and around the world. So, I mean, this is something of great actuality for many of us. For the MAGR students, I mean, risk obviously clearly involves a whole range of disasters, catastrophes, and this figures in Dr. Mayer's course that some of you are taking. Dr. Guha began her career in Kolkata, in Delhi, where she studied public health and epidemiology. She has a BA from the University of Calcutta and an MS in epidemiology and biostatistics from Johns Hopkins University. She's currently a senior fellow at the School of Public Health of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. She studied for her PhD at Johns Hopkins and then completed it at the Catholic University of Louvain in Brussels. And since the 1990s, she's been the director of the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters in Brussels, which is one of the leading centers in this field. So she's had tremendous experience, which she's going to share with us this evening. We've agreed that we will do this more as a dialogue than a standard lecture and Q&A. So we'll begin with a few of my own questions, and then quite quickly we'll come to you. So as we begin, do be thinking over what aspects of all of this you would like to focus on in the next hour or so that we have together. And as many of you are thinking about careers, and it's always very interesting to know how a person gets from a BA and an MS and a PhD to be the director of a leading institute of this sort. I thought we just might begin by Dr. Guha's career path. Maybe you'd like to share with us some of that.
Career path. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. And I was just telling Michael that I'm not so sure if I would have the energy at 6:30 having a whole day of classes to actually come and listen to some unknown person blabber on, rabbit on about something or the other for an hour and a half. So yes, so thank you very much. Thank you for having invited me. Michael invited me some time ago, and so I'm happy to be here. I mean, apart from being able to talk to you, to be in Bologna, which is really one of the nicer places that you could go to. So my parcours, as it were, how did I get to where I am, especially in Belgium? Lived and grew up in India, a good country, and I studied and grew even more up in the United States, also a very big country. And then I was moving to Brussels, which the population seemed like the size of my extended family. So I was just thinking, why am I doing this? Belgium was known in India only for mirrors. None of you will know about it because there are some of the very big companies were mirrors. So they made very good mirror because the water is very good. Also beers. So what happened? I did my undergraduate in public health and biostatistics, in statistics mostly. I was always a quantitative person. I like quantitative work. I did my first 4 years of medical studies as well, because the idea was that I was going to do medicine, clinical medicine. And very soon towards the end of the first 4 years, and in India at that time, medical school was 5 years, and then you did your generalist specialization for 2 other years. And by the time I had finished towards the end of it, I had already realized that clinical medicine is not for me. You really have to have a certain kind of a mentality to want to do clinical medicine. It's a different way of thinking about things, and a different lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that you pick up, and essentially you end up having to do it for the whole of your life. And I thought, when I'm 50, do I really want to have done 30 years of this? And the answer was no. So I went to Hopkins, and Hopkins was, at that time, and probably now as well, I'm this one, was a very, it was very open-minded. I think maybe all American universities much more open-minded than it was in India. In other words, what they said to me was that you can do any kind of studies, quantitative studies, mathematics and statistics is what I wanted to do, as long as you pass your exams. Essentially, you have to pass your exams. And if you don't pass your exams in the first year of your studies, you don't have a scholarship anymore. That was a very big incentive. I mean, very big. So, you have to eat at the end of the day. So I did mostly quantitative biostatistics, which is what I liked, I enjoyed, and I finished my degree there. And then, of course, as many of you have already maybe experienced or will experience, love came into the picture. Yeah, love came into the picture, and suddenly when love comes into the picture, everything else gets pushed out, right? Everything else, there's nothing else on the screen, there's only this. And this particular case, the option was that the love object in question had finished his PhD at Hopkins and was going back home, which was Brussels. And so he packed up and was going back home, and I, like a good Indian woman, also packed up and went with him. And I ended up in Brussels and I met an extraordinary man called Michel Lechat, an epidemiologist. He was a leprologist, actually, by infectious disease guy. And he told me, look, I have some money, I've received some money to do some work in disaster epidemiology. And I was like, disaster epidemiology? I mean, disasters at that time was a Red Cross affair, right? There was a huge disaster in Bangladesh, as Michael said, or somewhere else, and you send blankets. It's like 42 degrees in the shade, but you send blankets. So, disaster epidemiology. She said that if you want that job, you can have it. If not, you have to be a volunteer. So I took the job. And that's how I started. So it's really, I mean, starting the career, it's really a question of opportunity, and part of it is taking an opportunity, and then usually you find, not always, but usually you find you can manipulate your circumstances to make it maybe not exactly what you had in mind, but something like what you had in mind. And that's what happened. And there I was in disaster.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, there are quite a few takeaways from all of that. For all of us, I think serendipity, the role of serendipity and luck, but making your own luck and then recognizing it when it comes along, and taking risks and being offered possibilities and going with them, even if you hadn't thought of them previously. I mean, many careers, I think my own career as well, evolved this way, who would have thunk it? But in fact, very often it's a matter of recognizing opportunities when they come along. I thought we might spend a few minutes on what I advise students to do, particularly in my writing for public policy workshop, and that is to begin with definitions as part of the introduction. And we're using these terms, and they're used rather generally: disaster, catastrophe, preparedness, epidemics, pandemics. Is the sort of everyday understanding of these terms broadly accurate? Or do we need to think in a bit more detail about what these terms really mean.
So definitions, I mean, the word definition sort of, it's immediately eyes glaze over, you know, it's like, you think of these thick textbooks, which definitions of this, which you instantly forget. But however, I think it's an important point, partly because I think definitions does clarify your own thinking, because you know what the borders are, and you know where you don't want to sort of go over the borders, and make the whole thing vague, and then you're actually two people are talking on a different. Somebody's phone is ringing.
It's the church.
Isn't it awful? Absolutely awful. I was just thinking, somebody has church bells for a phone.
No, it's beautiful, Eleonora. Leave it. Okay. Yeah, so definitions are boring, but still,
but still,
I mean,
and it's kind of it's interesting, the question of definitions. So let's start with disasters. I work on what? I work on disasters, natural disasters, but I also work quite a lot, and currently, right now, we're doing two interesting studies in Sudan and Gaza. I work on civil conflicts. So there's a lot of work. I have a whole career in civil conflicts. So any kind of essentially humanitarian crisis. No. So let me begin with a good example of something which is very actual in civil conflicts, and that's genocide. There's genocide. We talk a lot of genocide, and the definition of genocide, in fact, the legal definition of genocide does not require any deaths. It does not require any deaths. In the International Criminal Court or in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, you have to be able to prove that there was an intention of wiping out a particular ethnic or a racial or a religious group. You have to prove the intention. There does not need to have anybody dead. Now, this is a very, very important definitional issue. Because in other words, it's not a question of how many people died. I mean, you know, in Darfur, when there was the quote unquote genocide in 2006, there was a whole thing about, 400 people have died and 400,000 people have died. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. Even if one person has died, it can still be a genocide. Disasters. Let's take the disasters. Natural. What is a disaster? This is a sticky problem, and it unfortunately does not have a definition which, from where I'm sitting, from where I'm coming from, for me, a definition has to have some kind of a quantitative. So you have to be able to say, you have to be able to measure an event. So in other words, what is it? It means that either you have a definition of disasters, which says that, which is very common actually, the UN disaster risk reduction, whatever, what is it? UN disaster risk reduction, UNDRR, that's right. Risk reduction secretariat or whatever. They will say that a disaster is any event that overwhelms the local capacity to respond. That is a disaster. So it's a qualitative definition. Overwhelms the local capacity to respond. So they have to ask for help. And so to me, it's too vague a definition. It just doesn't work for me. You know, I think it may be good enough for, say, UN discussions of COP29 or COP28. You know, the COP29 hasn't yet happened, so COP28 and so on and so forth. When they discuss gun disasters are becoming a big discussion item. It wasn't some time ago. Maybe it's good enough for that, because then you can put anybody's country's emergencies in that package. Overwhelms the local capacity. We have a definition which says that it has to have at least 10 people dead. It has to have at least 100 people affected. So in other words, by affected, we mean either homeless or having been evacuated or have lost their livelihoods. So they cannot earn their living anymore. And the fourth criteria for the definition is having the need for international help or national help. So in other words, it comes together with the first overwhelming the local capacity. So that is a disaster for us. So in our research and in our data, we will not consider a disaster if it has not killed either 10 people, it has not affected 100, or not and or 100 people, and it has not asked for international assistance. So that's a disaster. People always object to it, yes, but 2 people have died and the families are devastated. When you make a definition, one has to be strong enough to defend it, because there will be attacks. This is not good enough. What else? Another a good definitional issue is refugees, people who have been displaced, either displaced because of natural disasters or displaced because of war, or war and natural disasters. One of the big issues right now, and it's been for years actually, we've not been able to do anything about it, is droughts, famine, and civil conflicts, right? So this is what you have, is a climate-related event, a drought, and you have a man-made event, which is a civil conflict, refugees. And then you have people who leave their homes and they've gone somewhere else. Now, what happens when they leave their homes and gone somewhere else? They can have 2 status. One is they can cross an international border. Unless they cross, have they had all of this? Am I repeating stuff?
Go ahead. This is not a field really that people address directly, indirectly, I think, in the context of risk, but no, it's extremely useful.
Okay.
Go.
So I'm babbling on and they've learned all of this.
No.
So refugees, the only people who are refugees and who have the right to aid, so UNHCR can help them, the only ones, they are people who cross an international border. If you cannot cross an international border, you will not get help. You will not get refugee status, you will be an internally displaced person, an IDP, and you will have much less rights to aid. And it's a big difference. It's a very big difference. That's a definition that has been accepted. Enough definitions?
But the one of the perplexities of the non-specialists, for example, you mentioned natural disasters and war. I mean, are there still purely natural disasters? The usual cycle is that we think a natural disaster has occurred. On a small scale, Emilia-Romagna last year, terrible floods, right? And this seems to be related to climate change and who knows what. And then a year later, it happens again. And then everyone says, well, the local authorities received a major allocation of funds from Rome, and they didn't spend it at all or properly in the year. So it's happened again a year later. Is that a natural disaster, or is that a man-made disaster? Or does this distinction make any sense at all?
Yeah, well, actually, there is a whole bagarre, I don't know, dispute going on about this word natural, and we use it a lot, and in the publications, in research, it's still used a lot, natural disasters. I think if you want to be pedantic about it, then it's a, what is it? They have it's a naturally triggered man-made disaster. Yeah, so you back everything in. Essentially, what is happening is that if you look at the trends in natural disasters in the last 20 or 30 years, trends. So we monitor natural disasters from 1900. From 1900. All natural disasters for 180 countries. And now if you look at the last 30 years, natural disasters, this is not going to sound politically correct, but I'll say it anyway. Natural disasters has not increased. Natural disasters. I know your question was a little different, whether or not it's natural. So natural disasters has not increased, but it is related to what you said. Natural disasters have not increased. Now this creates a huge pushback from the climate community, because I mean, I just did a Swedish journalist last week who came down from Stockholm. A huge pushback saying, what, natural disasters? And then of course it does. I mean, this is what the whole climate story is about. And, and this climate thing is ruining us all and we're all going to die horrible deaths very soon. And you're saying natural disasters doesn't. What is actually happening, in fact? I mean, I'm not putting my hand on the fire on it, but this is our analysis. But what is happening is that if you look at the trend of natural disasters, which has been going up in the last 30 years, very clearly going up, and then it has flattened out. Part of this increase is been due to better reporting. As any statistician will tell you, is that it's like in epidemiology. If you go out and look for malaria cases in a village, you will find many more malaria cases, right? So it's what is called active surveillance. You go out and look house to house, malaria cases. Sure enough, you will have double the number of cases that you had before. Passive surveillance in epidemiology is when you sit down in your medical consultancy room and you wait for the malaria cases to come to you. And you will have much fewer. So what is happening here is that as 1970s came on, as 1980s came on, we started getting much better reports from disasters from Nouvelle Caledonie, from, I don't know, Papua New Guinea, from God knows where else in the remote reaches of the world. The reporting was much better. Telecommunications was cheap. It was almost free. So we collected a lot of the data. And so the number of disasters increased. But that was not the only thing. No doubt there was some real increase. Okay? There was some real increase, but we don't know what the bias is. We don't know what the bias is. Now that it's flattened out, I was in Sharjah 2 days ago. I didn't even know where Sharjah was, but I don't know whether anybody here knows.
UAE.
You're from Sharjah? No. Could have been. Yes, it's in
the United Arab Emirates.
It's one of the Emirates. It's about very close to Dubai. Anyway, I was in Sharjah and I looked at what is happening in the world with natural disasters and why is it why is it not going up and does that mean anything? What is happening, quite interestingly, is that the number of people, disasters itself, the events, as defined by us, those disasters are not good. But each disaster is actually affecting more people than it did before. And that is the part which is managed. What is happening? The same number of disasters. So you have the same flood or the same earthquake. It's not a climate disaster, the same earthquake. But today, wildfires, even heat, extreme heat. Those are all the different kinds of natural disasters. Those disasters, those events, which 20 or 30 years ago would have affected 50,000, 100,000, 250,000 people, today can affect up to 750,000 because of density of populations, especially density of populations in areas where, for the case of floods, and for poor countries, areas where floods occur. Why? Because floods bring fertile soil. Floods bring fertile soil. For people liked floods. People like floods. Not floods that completely carry away your entire family and all your cattle, but at least floods were a welcome thing in poor countries because floods bring in topsoil. So that's why people come and live in those areas. Volcanic slopes in Indonesia, volcanic slopes, it's fertile area. So they go and live there. And then when there's a volcano, you have many more people who die, actually. So what's happening is that the disasters are maybe not increasing, but the people who are exposed have increased, and that is because of bad development policy. And in Emilia-Romagna, it doesn't entirely surprise me. I mean, this was floods, was it? Yeah, that's right. There were major floods. There were major floods in Germany 2 years ago and Belgium as well. So
Central Europe, Hungary, Czech Republic,
Poland, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The good thing about this is that the technology that is available for flood control is very, very good and not expensive, not any more expensive. But if you don't have the political will to be able to do it, I mean, Belgium had big floods. Belgium is a rich country. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It's a rich country. In 2021, there were floods in southern Belgium. 40 people died as a direct result of floods, not because of heart attacks 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. No, as a direct result. 40 people died. 40 people dead from a 2-day flood in a country like Belgium is a lot of people. 200 people died from the same flood in Germany. 200. That's a lot of people. And part of it is that land zoning and regulations on how close you can build your houses to the riverbanks were not imposed. The regulations are there. We have regulations, but these were not actually implemented, which means poorer people, most of the people who died, we interviewed every single family, every single 40 families. Most of the people who died were poor families, uneducated mostly, and poor families. And what does that mean? That means that they take cheaper land, which is on, what is the word? It's not swarmy, marshy lands. Marshy lands, they build their houses there because it's cheap land. It's cheap land. The other thing about poorer families, even in countries like Europe, is that poorer families have a much lesser, I know this is not going to sound nice, but much lesser capacity to listen to warnings or instructions and absorb them, and maybe less means to actually act on them. They simply don't have the capacity to act on them. So you have older people who are not very literate, who have heard on the radio that there's a flood when maybe, the waters are rising and things, move on. But where would they go? So if you don't have a whole chain of preparedness acts, communication, the early warning, and then the action to be taken in the early warning and to protect people's things.
Without coming back to definitions, I mean, you used the word preparedness that's in the title of your talk as well. I mean, during the period that you've been working in this area, and you explained to us how you got into it, which is now several decades, what is the big picture about preparedness? I mean, have we taken on board in our different political systems, notwithstanding problems of multi-level governance of the sort that maybe played a role in Emilia-Romagna and elsewhere? Who's in charge? Is it the region? Is it the commune? Is it the central government, etc.? But the big picture about preparedness during your period working on this, is it a good story or not?
It's a good story, but certainly I'll come back again to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country which is an what's the prize student called? That's the best student in the class, whatever they're called. I'm sure you will.
We have them all here, so they can tell.
The Bangladesh.
Cum laude.
Yes, Bangladesh is definitely a summa cum laude. It's a poor country. It used to be a desperately poor country. It's not a desperately poor country anymore, but it's still a poor country. Bangladesh has done extraordinarily in preparedness and prevention. Certain amount of prevention. Remember, some things cannot be prevented. A cyclone cannot be prevented. You can't prevent a cyclone from it. It will come, whatever happens. Floods can be prevented. Floods can be prevented. And Bangladesh has done marvelously well. There is when I see the bigger picture, you talk about bigger pictures. Now, bigger pictures, I mean, it's a philosophy. It's different people have different philosophies. So, I'm an agnostic, I'm a Hindu. I admit to all possible philosophies that you can bring up in front of me. So everything is good. But as far as preparedness is concerned, I think the philosophy is that preparedness will mostly work. I think mostly, I'm being a bit cautious here, mostly work if it's community-based. You know, that to me is, I mean, these are local events. Disasters are local events. Local events in the sense it's not local in your village. I mean, some of the cyclone paths will cut through a huge swathe, but in general, and earthquakes as well, it's extraordinary how the local community is in fact the first responder, is in fact the first responder. Whichever way you look at it and whichever country you take is the first responder. And so somehow, I think, if the IPCC and the climate world at this time does not take into account the fact that the strength for disaster preparedness lies in the community, lies in bringing together the different communities to respond, to be able to adapt, I think it's going to be a hard uphill slog. You know.
Could you give us a few examples of that so we can get a feel for it a bit more? Examples of the community as first responders.
I'll give you from earthquakes, so not from climate. There are some very before I came to Monsieur Lecha, worked with Monsieur Lecha, who was an incredibly imaginative man. Mark the Troika, there were two men who were in that group, and Lecha, they did studies. This was a long time ago, but since then more studies have been done. They did the first seminal study in Campania, in Naples, in Italy. There was an earthquake here many years ago. I think I was even still a student. They did study in Campania. And then after that, we did more studies of the same kind later on, even for famines. And that gives you a very good idea of what communities can do. The mortality, the profile of deaths in the Campania earthquake, in the Naples earthquake, in which many people died, it was one of the biggest ones, showed what? They did an epidemiology study, very interesting epidemiology study, really good. They found that, in fact, the mortality rates were higher, statistically significantly higher, among men, young men, between the ages, and actually there was an earthquake here, L'Aquila.
Yeah.
Remember L'Aquila? Same thing, same pattern.
Well, that Friuli, there was one Friuli.
There was before that in Friuli, yes. Italy has had its share of earthquakes. So what did they see? They found that there was a mortality rate that was significantly higher among men between the ages of something like, I can't remember now, like 21, 22 to about 26, 27. That age group. And that age group is an age group where the lowest mortality rate normally, right? They are the strongest in our societies. Young men. Young men are the strongest. They are the most resistant to death. They are the most resistant to death. Old people die, young mothers with small children die because they can't run away with their children. Very young people die, children die. But here the men die. There was this men. And they did like focus groups afterwards. What happens is that most of the people who were brought out of the earthquake living, because a lot of people are brought out of the earthquake dead. That's the thing, huh? They send the dogs and the dogs arrive after 2 days and anybody that they find are actually dead people. So the people that they brought out living were brought out by their family members or their neighbors on the palier, on the floor that they were living in. The national rescue people arrive maybe 12 hours. 12 hours, 18 hours, and especially since they had to take the debris off. And the international help arrived, and international help were operational, not arrival, operational. They are operational usually 24 to 48 hours later. Whoever had to die is dead by that time. So what does this show? It shows that the people around you are your first responders. And this is true also for cyclones. Nargis, the cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. The people who were saved by them. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that you have a golden hour of survival it's not an hour, but you 6 hours. And that 6 hours, it's only your community that can help you, not international aid and not even national aid. That's the story.
Maybe last question from me before opening up. I mean, when we talk about epidemics and pandemics, I mean, within the lifetime of most people here, the most obvious example was COVID. I mean, what are the lessons to draw from the response to COVID by public authorities in Europe and for that matter around the world? I mean, on balance, and thinking back to the period that you've been working in this field, I mean, can we consider that the response was as good as we had reason to expect? Or were there obvious failings which we should begin to address as part of our preparedness for possible future epidemics?
Right. I mean, COVID was a bit of a standalone case because, you know, it was a virus. The coronavirus was not very well known. The only ones we really knew well were related to cold and cold-like diseases, and otherwise it was a not very well known condition. That gives you a handicap. You know, however well you are, however big the laboratories are and things, that is a handicap. So there is a genuine reason for not having managed it quite as well as one could manage. There is, a genuine defensible reason. But something else happened. Two things happened actually, which I think was absolutely critical. One was that there was a very quick erosion of trust in data, erosion of trust in institutional authorities. I did not say governmental authorities because it was not only government, but there was an erosion of trust in government, in institutional authorities. So when the messages went out for protection of all kinds, I mean, okay, now today mask is goes without saying and so on and so forth, but at that time, even before, you know, the confinement and things, there was a huge kind of pushback and a rather a surprising politicization, more or less, politicization of this disease. I have rarely, I mean, I've been on many epidemics, Ebola, you know, big ones, really bad ones, dengue, but the politicization for COVID was very, very important. And that was linked to the trust. And this trust thing was completely destroyed. And it makes it very hard to deal with the community problem. Like if you have, you know, all this stuff that went around, Mr. Gates was spending his time putting, what was this, putting, at least in Belgium, Mr. Gates was spending his time putting microchips, right? You've heard about that. And people, you know, my cleaning lady believed it. You know, she did. She wouldn't be vaccinated. And so on and so forth. So that was an unusual thing. The other thing that I think is more forward-looking, and people are doing it much better now and doing a very good job with it. There was just somebody who got a prize on which I was on the jury, is that surveillance, just plain old garden variety surveillance, disease surveillance, had completely broken down over here. Broken down, why? Because we have very little disease over here, you know, infectious disease, very little. Very small proportion. And so nobody really cared for 50 years. It wasn't an issue. People don't even vaccinate their children against polio. And, you know, I'm a big vaccination fan, so you have to forgive me for this. But, you know, people don't even vaccinate their children. So, okay, so there was no surveillance. And now they're starting like really innovative surveillance schemes because of COVID on monitoring wastewater, looking at wastewater. I think there are all kinds of innovative things that are coming up. Surveillance is going to be much stronger, but I think the lack of trust, and I don't know whether that's what happening, was a very big factor. Yeah.
We might have been shaken a bit from our complacency in terms of preparedness because of the future.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open up the discussion. And if you'd like to ask about any aspect of the subject that we've raised or not raised, please feel free. Also, for those following online, if you'd like to put your questions into the Q&A, I will relay them. If you just introduce yourself briefly, who would like to begin?
Thank you for being here. My name is Ryan Gibbs. I'm a first-year student. Related to your last comment there on COVID, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, in my experience working in emergency management, there has been kind of a high level of mistrust in government and a lack of confidence in government and federal agencies, both in the United States and in the developing world. I've experienced that a lot firsthand. My question to you is that what do you believe the most appropriate pathway is to increasing that level of, at least in that level of confidence, and engaging with communities at least proximal to exigent events?
You know, it's a difficult question that you ask, because it's an, where was it? Was it Nigeria, one of those Western African countries? I can't remember which one. I think it was Nigeria, where I mean, I won't even go into Fauci and that was me there thinking about, but Nigeria.
No Boris Johnson, I hear.
No Boris Johnson, yes. I mean, honestly, the global north should have known better, but they didn't. But in countries like Nigeria and things, they had what happened there, for example, the trust in government. When the government asked them to for the confinement things, they didn't make any effort whatsoever, and they said this is all a made-up story by the government. Because why? Because a year ago, 2 years ago, the government, I can't remember exactly, government did something like made up a kind of a frightening scenario and recuperated the budget from the health ministry to go into, I don't know what, something else, okay? Now that kind of a story, you see, feeds into distrust of the government, and in this case, legitimately so. Legitimately so. You do mistrust a government which, you know, does things like that. Now your question is, what is there to be done to build up confidence? You know, honestly, I don't have an answer to that, because it's a political answer. You know, it's a political answer. And I have not been in politics ever in my life, so I can't feel, but again, I don't want to kind of belabor my point, is that somehow if we don't bring, I know this is going to sound a bit cheesy, but if you don't bring our government down a little more closer to the people's lives and livelihoods, if there is still a very big gap between especially for big countries like the United States, where the gap is probably very big. People don't see any kind of really, I think it's going to be very hard to build up the trust. Yeah.
And it will get very polarized, and it becomes part of wider debates, wider political debates.
Yes.
In our highly polarized societies. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. And
For the people in line.
thank you very much for your insights. My name is Josephine, and I actually have a focus on global health. So this has been very insightful. And I was wondering if you could talk to us more about the work you currently do and which types of methodologies you use, especially with like looking at how quantitative and qualitative methods complement each other in your work.
Yeah, well, so what am I doing right now? I'm working, as I told you in the beginning, I'm working on Gaza and Sudan, on an area which I have a long specialty, which is estimating death tolls, estimating mortality. So I do a lot of work on how do you measure Iraq, in Yemen, how do you measure how many people have died due to the conflict in these countries. So I'll give you just 1 or 2 liner on that. The natural disasters, we do a lot of work on risk analysis, risk factor. What are the risk factors that make a community, any group of people who are living in a flooded area or have lived in flood-prone areas or living in flooded areas and exposed to flood. So now you can bring in classical epidemiological design in looking at exposure and outcome. This is stuff that is really epidemiology 101. That's really basic epidemiology. So you look at who have been exposed to the flood or to a cyclone, and then you look at who are the people who have died or have been injured. And if your design is good, if your method is good, you're going to be able to distinguish which people in that community are at higher risk of death. Because not everybody is at risk of death when they're exposed to something. So we can be in this room and there can be 3 of us who have some kind of an virus, a cold. Nobody's sneezing, I noticed, but anyway, there can be 3 people here who have a cold.
We left the window open.
Aerated, absolutely. But not all of us will be exposed to these 3 people, but not all of us are going to be ill. And that is the basis of epidemiology. It's an extremely powerful approach, because then you start seeing of the 500 people who have been exposed to the floods or exposed to any cyclone, how many of them were dead and what were their characteristics? And they will share characteristics one day. And it's the epidemiologist's job to find what is the characteristics that they share. And so those are essentially we do standard epidemiological risk analysis for that. And for the mortality in conflicts, we do a lot of excess mortality stuff, use methods of excess mortality, or we do very simple cluster surveys, 2-stage cluster surveys. In Gaza, we are starting a cluster survey now. So that's a random. So standard epidemiology methods, you can't beat it. You can't beat it, honestly.
I mean, I have more questions.
Well, we'll come later there are others, but we have a moment, so.
I wanted to thank you for that response. And this is a very selfish question to ask on my end because I'm thinking about what to write my master's thesis on right now. But I wanted to ask what you think big questions are that the jury is still out on in your field. What are things you haven't found out yet?
The 2 areas are very different, civil conflicts and natural disasters. Do you have a predilection on one or the other? Otherwise,
I mean, my preference is civil conflict, but whatever you think is more interesting, yeah. Civil conflict.
yes, there is a huge, I don't know what to call it, a huge conflagration, and it's because of Gaza and Sudan, on what are the comparative merits of the different ways of measuring death tolls, right? So there is a group in Johns Hopkins who does it at the School of Public Health. There's a group in London School of Hygiene. There are others, Columbia, Karolinska. There are these groups, and they all have different ways of doing it. So that is a very big question that people are sort of argue over and debate over, and different methods will bring completely different death tolls. And those are important things. What does one possible? There are others.
You can be in touch to pursue it a little further. Nina. A little behind you, and we'll come to you next. Yeah. No, go. No, we'll come to you in just a second.
Hi, Nina Gardner, and I'm an adjunct professor in Washington, and I teach business and human rights, but so I have more of a international human rights lens, and I'm just asking, going back to the whole issue of definitions. Have you picked up any movement on the definition of climate refugee? Because I don't think it's officially recognized, right? So in your sort of, in your work, have you heard that something's gonna be, there's movement on that? And the other definition, which I think we need to focus, and governments need to focus much more on, given, again, back on climate, is the issue of adaptation, right? Because the Paris agreements really focus on two things. Mitigation, which we talk about a lot, adaptation, not so much. And then there's the whole question, of course, of the budgeting. So just wanted to throw those out.
Yeah, climate refugees, I've heard of this thing, it comes up. Nancy, was it? No, what was
Nina.
Nina, his name. It has no meaning for me. It's a meaningless word, honestly. I mean, unless somebody puts some meaning into it, maybe, you will after having done research. It's, for me, to be very frank with you, Nina, it's a meaningless word. It has no meaning. What is a climate refugee? You know what? I mean, maybe you can enlighten me, but it seems like a kind of a catch-all word where you can put anybody in it.
Well, I would say droughts, floods, everything you were talking about that is created by climate. A lot of refugees are now climate refugees.
Yes, but that is simply somebody who has displaced themselves due to an extreme event. That is what it is, an extreme event. Sorry, you're.
No, what I was thinking of is that it's part of a wider discussion about the Geneva Convention being completely out of date now,
Right.
where the working definition of refugee that everybody still uses comes from. And everyone in Europe especially says how important it is to distinguish between an asylum seeker, a refugee, and an economic migrant. Then you go back to the Geneva Convention and you're stuck on this notion of a well-founded fear of persecution, which in fact was a definition following the Second World War. And it began with the refugees or the Jewish victims of Nazism, and then the people who left their countries because of communism after the beginning of the Cold War. And we're stuck on that. So we know that climate changes are a source of migration, and we know that conflict is a source of migration. But to change to the Geneva Convention, to have a new treaty or more is an almost impossible task. So the idea of climate refugee, so to speak, I mean, in a way, for the moment, the two terms are contradictory given our existing definition of refugee. But perhaps the underlying question, is the plea for a broader definition of what a refugee is. And I don't know what you think.
Or a broader definition of what climate is. I don't know how much broader you can possibly get, but I would say that what you're saying about climate is more an extreme event. It's not climate. I mean, climate has been changing and has been changing forever, really. So to say climate refugee seems to me a little ingenuous even, I would say. It's like making a statement about anybody would fall into it, any poor person in Afghanistan or would fall into a climate refugee. No? I would.
To be pursued.
I'd be very happy to be enlightened on this. I have heard of the term. I've just sort of, but I don't know what it means, and I don't know, so.
We'll come back.
Yes, the other thing, sorry, she asked about
Okay,
adaptation,
sorry.
and I just want to say one thing about adaptation. To me, it's, I'm saying a very foncé views. To me, adaptation is our only solution right now. Honestly, 30 years of COP and this and that and IPCC, I have the greatest respect for this. I was one of the authors about that. All of that said, we have not done one big thing. Honestly, nothing has happened. The only thing that's happened, it's gotten worse. Okay, so we have to learn a lesson from that. That's all. We have to say that, sorry, what we've been doing has not worked. But meanwhile, there are people who are going to be facing emergent conditions not in 30 years, not in 20 years, but next year. What do we do about them? You know, try to tell a Laotian peasant or an old lady in some, very hot part of the United States that, don't worry, in 30 years, we're going to get it solved. You know, honestly,
I think politicians are afraid to talk about adaptation because it sort of distracts attention from prevention. And prevention is the political priority that everybody has banged on the table. There are other areas where people are afraid to talk about certain realities because how it will be categorized politically or what, and it could be like almost disloyal, to the climate goals to start talking about adaptation, which implies acceptance.
capitulation.
Whereas the whole, discourse is one of prevention, but, well, also to be pursued. I'm sorry that we asked you to wait a few moments.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Marissa. I'm a first year EMDAT student. I actually have two questions. The first has to do with your earlier point about community-based interventions. I find that a lot of big.
Sorry, Nina, what please?
Marisa.
Oh, Marissa, yes. Community-based interventions.
Yeah,
Sorry if you can't hear me.
sorry.
I find that a lot of big donors in humanitarian work often tend to work on systems level, like higher than the community, and as of recently, actually individual focused interventions. How do you think we can turn the needle on more community-based interventions? Like, what do you think we can do with the big donors to convince them that the change lies in the community for disaster risk reduction? The second question, it might be getting too in the weeds of what you do, but how do you work in a context like Gaza where access is hard, you can't get the data easily, and there's discrepancies in reports, especially with casualties?
Yeah. I know mentioning the word Gaza, I thought about it. So should I actually mention it at all? Because it will immediately solicit the question that you, I mean, it's a totally valid question, something that we have been discussing all the time, the little group that's working on this. How to shift the needle on this community thing? I think the needle is already shifting a little bit. I think, and it's led by, WHO is far behind. They haven't even woken up. I mean, they're still snoring away wherever it is that they snore. But the big foundations, I mean, despite, people being against one of these, I must say I have not even a sneaking admiration, but definitely a kind of an admiration for the Gates Foundation. For the Gates Foundation, they have a lot of money and they have changed some very big things. One is they've changed something that, I am absolutely convinced. One, that's vaccines. So let's put that aside because I could go on and on about it. But they have also done a great deal in changing the thought of coming down and working at the community level. So things are changing. There's a problem with this community level thing. The problem is to me, at this time, it's more or less an insoluble problem, is that the partners at the community level, so, the NGO partners at the community level, you have a problem with that because if you give them a lot of money, they are outside the legal jurisdiction of the donor. They are outside the legal jurisdiction of the donor. So while if you can have a kind of a knee-jerk kind of a thing saying that, oh, the community organizations must get the money and it's not the Western NGOs and it's not the guys who are clones of the Western NGOs and things, it has to be the local organization. Sounds really good. But in reality, those organizations are outside the jurisdiction of the legal framework of the donors, and that's a problem. So I don't know how that will be solved. But it is moving towards that. I think people have realized that, it doesn't work. This other big group in JPAL, the Harvard group, they do a lot of, I think they've been pushing quite a bit on the right direction. Gaza, how's Gaza? Gaza, the problem with Gaza is that the death tolls of Gaza, all the death tolls, whoever has come up with, so many people died and so many people died, they all, at the end of the day, it's like we are here, they all come down to Rome, all roads lead to Rome, all come down to the Ministry of Health. everything, whatever you see out there on the radar screen, the data, everything comes from the Ministry of Health. This is a problem. So right now, what did we do? What have we done? We hope that is going to work. We find out in a matter of 2 or 3 months. We work with an opinion poll organization who are partners with a center called the Arab Barometer, who are in, I think, Yale or Princeton. They're in Princeton, and a very respected group. And so Arab Barometer and myself and 2 other colleagues, Norwegian chaps and British. So we will be working, we make the design, we make the whole methodology, we do the questionnaire. It's a very short questionnaire. It's literally a page and a half long on the mortality and they did the sampling and they did the survey. Let's see if it works.
Devesh.
I wanted to get you to think about your definition in the longer arc of the history. So all revolutions imply civil conflict. Almost every revolution would meet your definitional criteria of being a disaster. Right? A number of people killed, displaced. The American and the French Revolution at the time when they occurred, by your definition, would be disasters. In the long arc of history, would it still be your definition?
It's Vinod.
Was this a provocation, Dev? We're supposed to be provocative on occasions like this. So were the French and the American revolutions disasters? Or do we have a methodology for thinking about revolutions, civil conflicts, and should we think of these in the context of disasters, if I interpret it correctly?
I have to confess that our work, first of all, I have an easy way out of this, a very, very easy parachute here. The definition that I told you about the 10 dead and things applies only to natural disasters. We don't have a definition for civil conflict. We don't have a definition. So I can immediately leave the room safely, having said my definition applies to natural disasters and civil conflicts has political definitions. There are all those guys in the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. They have definitions and they work on this. But the other parachute that I have several parachutes in my bag. I have difficult questions like yours. The other parachute is that we do very little what I would consider truly intellectual work. Because your question is what I would call a truly intellectual question about how the historical picture pans out in these revolutions. How does that? And we have always been very operational. Our work has been very operational. Our work has been our research, and I don't even know whether true scientists would call it, research in the sense that it's meant, has been really to improve humanitarian aid. Is how can we get better humanitarian aid? And so there's been very little thought in our center, in our group, and even the world in which we are in, our milieu, as it were. They have always been very operational. So I must beg out of this because we have just not been intellectually, rigorous enough to look at the historical picture. That's essentially it.
Could I ask a follow-up question just on that? The reason I was asking you is just to, there's work which I can talk to you about later, that when is it that disasters might have a silver lining?
A silver lining.
Silver lining.
When they may be actually good?
There are. That's the one I can deal with. That's the one I can deal with. I mean, right now, it's a topic that I did quite a lot of work on many years ago. So I even published on it, but again, so I know so many examples. Definitely silver linings. Definitely silver linings. Several disasters have silver linings. Earthquakes have silver linings. Earthquakes have silver linings. You have a good earthquake. You know, there are at least 3 examples. I think that she's laughing. What a good earthquake. You have, there were 3 examples that I used to use, but now I can only remember 2. One was Managua in Nicaragua. Earthquake, big earthquake, you know, and the masses of the city fell. What happened after that? Within the year, the government fell. It was this awful government of who was the dictator? Yeah, Somoza. Yeah, it sounds like samosa, which is an Indian food. But yeah, Somoza's government fell because of the earthquake. Mengistu, same thing. You had the famine in Ethiopia. Okay, to me, those are silver linings. I mean, it's okay as a silver lining. I can handle that. So there are silver linings. You know, there are huge changes that follow a major crash. Yes, I know. A bunch of people die, and I mean, that's not very nice. But there are silver linings. Yeah.
I was in New Zealand shortly after the Christchurch earthquake, where 113, if I remember, people died, of which 100 were in a single building, which was the TV and radio building. And it turned out subsequently that the engineer who had built the building had earlier on in his career falsified his credentials. And they had not built into the structure the natural sort of earthquake protection that elsewhere saved lives. But one of the effects of this earthquake was a big uptick in the interest in New Zealand in the use of wood in construction. And various university centers are really focusing on that, an enormous increase in interest in that. Belgium, you know, in the Torres Hasti, they've done a huge structure in wood. And I'm not sure that the station, the Gare Maritime,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the motive for that had to do with earthquakes, but a kind of silver lining, I think, would be if people can quickly enough draw a conclusion, and if the authorities are open to action, you know, whether research or whether real action in changing building codes and so on. It sometimes happens.
It does, it does. The only thing, you know, where I will not, and God knows I've worked on it for, you know, long enough years, is I have not seen a silver lining that comes to mind from armed civil conflicts.
Mm.
I cannot think of one. I cannot think of one. Natural disasters, yes. Natural disasters, yes.
Okay, well, we got time for 2 or 3 more questions. Yes.
Thank you for being here. It's Roberta, PhD student in Econ for University of Bologna. I was thinking about the role of local communities, either in preparedness and the response to disasters. The question is, do you think local communities can still be better equipped to deal with the disasters without politicization of disasters? For example, if I think about Italy in a local way, I don't think that funding from foundations can be a solution to better equip these local communities. An ideal setting maybe could be to have local politicians on board in order to have public policies that could align public interest of the state with interest of local communities. Do you think is this effective, or it could be too risky to have politicians on board since they want to have a political return, and so they could use still disasters to enhance their likelihood to be re-elected. Thank you.
Local ownership at the political level, is that necessary? Is that something which is feasible? Why did you say that there's no point in trying to get foundations involved? What's the reason for that?
To the best of my knowledge, in Italy, foundations are not that strong.
Are not strong.
No.
No.
I don't know if Bill Gates Foundation would be interested to deal with the Emilia-Romagna flood. That is not climate-related disaster. There is no attribution to climate for Emilia-Romagna's flood. Italian foundations have different aims, like cultural. It's not about protection of environment. Still, maybe things will change. But if we wanna act right now, and you said we should act right now for example, flood, there is no time anymore to mitigate, but we need to adapt if we want to avoid the worst damages. Then I don't think foundations is the right thing for Italy.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. I mean, foundations actually don't have, I mean, I don't know why I'm saying this. The foundations, I mean, Germany has a lot of foundations which are very, very involved in not just cultural and political life and so on and so forth, and also in research, applied research and things. But I'd like to come back to what you were saying about aligning the community interests with the political interests. Now, wouldn't you think that community interest has an electoral value? That, you know, that at some point, I don't know about Italian politics at that level, but still, I would say, I just voted for at the communal level in Belgium last week. I would have said that interests of the community can be a real driver if it's a real democracy, and you know, and that the electorate can be a driver for an electoral interest. Wouldn't you say that? Isn't that the basics of a democracy, that you have a community, the community gets flooded every 3 years, every 4 years, you know, people lose their washing machines or God knows what in the basement, all of that. Wouldn't you say that there would be a dissatisfaction of the community, and that the person who's standing for election would be aware of that and would be encouraged to do something about the floods?
It's a matter of passing the buck, you know. I mean, what I've seen in Italy, but not only in Italy, I mean, Belgium too, there are issues about sort of multi-level governance and who should be addressing it, should be addressed at the local level, communal level, provincial level, regional level, national level. And it's very hard really for politicians to take a responsible attitude. But the idea that at the local level, politicians should respond and should be active if they want to get re-elected, where people are dissatisfied, I think that makes sense. It may also be cultural. I mean, the foundation's been very strong and active in one country, less so otherwise. To be continued. I think we'll have a last round of questions. I'm looking at the watch. So let's take several together. If you would be rather brief, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Warrington. My background is actually in public health, so that's really fascinating to me.
You have to speak closer to the mic.
Oh, sorry. My question is about the definitions that you're using and like how this affects the work that you do. So for instance, you know, you brought up the definition of refugee, and you know how like that definition could change if we start talking about climate refugees, or you brought up the definition of genocide, but around the world, there's actually not a universally accepted definition of genocide, and that's created on like an organizational basis. Also, you know, you brought up what the definition of disaster could be. So for instance, you said that there has to be like a push for national interest, but then like in the case of, you know, what she talked about, like there could be a potential for that doesn't define a disaster based on numbers, because of the fact that it's local responsibility rather than national responsibility. So then even though the it could impact 100 people, it wouldn't be considered a disaster. So I'm just curious, like how these changing definitions would impact the ability to do the work.
Okay, it's a clear question. Let's take a number of questions and yes, gentlemen.
My name's Ian. My question is, have you seen a shift in international aid more moving towards local focused preparedness and training over just general international response?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Leonard.
Thanks for taking the time on a Monday night. I wanted to ask about, I'm Alexandra Vadensis, also first year. I'm curious about, you were talking earlier about political will and questions around how long a crisis response after an earthquake takes. When we had the big earthquake last year in Syria and Turkey, there very quickly came up conversations around bad response on Erdogan's side. I'm quite curious in how far we can tell from the outside whether a tragic amount of people dying from an earthquake is actually related to kind of political will or more related to the circumstances of the earthquake.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just behind you, there, yes.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm just completing the great question of Ian. Actually, I was wondering if you could tell us about a time where response to a disaster was particularly good, but also about a time where a response was really bad, but the government or the organization that was in charge of the response thought it was going to be really good, and where did it fail?
Okay, well, there's quite a range of questions there. We've got maybe 10 minutes, so please address whichever of these come closest to your own experience.
Right, yeah. So let's start from Jasmine. Jasmine? Well, I can't even Jasmine.
Right.
Is that your name? Okay, this is already a good start. So definitions of I'll just quickly go through the stuff because all of them were rather important big questions, you know, it's like a one-line answer. The definitions of genocide and refugees are absolutely universally accepted. They are of the Geneva Conventions. They are the definitions that are used by the International Courts of Justice. Now, people can say whatever they like, but they cannot bring to the court a case against or in favor of genocide unless it fits into the universally accepted definition of a genocide or the definition of a refugee. Those are accepted things. People can not agree, but that's a different question. Disasters is simply a definition that we have developed, you know, our center has developed. It has no institutional value whatsoever. It has simply a research value because for us, it allows us to do we know what in epidemiology we would call an inclusion criteria. What do you include in a category and what do you not include in a category? And like if you have a patient, if you have a disease, you want to know whether this patient enters into your experimental design or it doesn't, this patient doesn't. So this is an entirely definition that we have developed to be able to do our research, but refugees and genocides are universal definitions, agree or not. Then there was Ian, shift in international aid to preparedness and training. Shift in international.
Question mark.
Yes.
Has there been?
Shift in international aid. Yes, I think there is. I think there is a movement. I think people, it takes the world, it takes, especially international aid, a lot of time to learn something. You learn it much faster, actually. So you should go into international aid. Maybe you can move some things there. But generally speaking, it moves very slowly. People don't like it. They have already budgeted money for this kind of thing, and it's not community, and they don't want to do it. They don't want to change. I mean, there's just really boring reasons why they don't want to do it. But all in all, there is a shift towards preparedness. There is a shift understanding that training is one of the crucial foundation stones. There is a shift. So it may come when you're close to retirement, but right now, at least there's a hope. Alexandra, Syrian Erdogan. Yes. Well, in that Gaziantep, which was where the most of the deaths were actually, Erdogan was, I mean, I don't want to be, I can say a lot of things that nobody likes about Erdogan, but there was a very big issue of building code in implementation, regulatory, like very big issue. And nobody took responsibility, including Erdogan, and he was rightly criticized for this. So a lot of the deaths in that region, in the region of the thing, I don't know what's the Syrian side, but at least in Turkey, a lot of the deaths was simply because of building infrastructure failures. And for that, I'm sorry, the ministers have to take responsibility, they really do. And that was the Turkish earthquake. Nobody did any studies on it though. I don't think the government would have liked it. So who's this?
Emma.
Emma asked about?
Examples of good and bad responses.
Well, a good response is Haiti. I know it sounds awful because, so many people died in Haiti. But Haiti, I was there for quite a long time, right after, not immediately after, but a little bit later, maybe 4 weeks or 5 weeks later. Haiti had a pretty good response. It must be said something very, very particular about Haiti is that, and I've seen that in other places as well. Somalia, I've seen it, is one of the reasons why the Haiti response was effective and effective and efficient was the involvement of the military. The involvement of the military can be an extremely helpful involvement, depending on the country. Now, if the military is hated by the people, not a good idea, really not a good idea. But if it's not, here you had, Haiti has the good luck of being very close to the Southern Command of Florida. And so they had the Southern Command mobilized within a matter of, hours. And that was extraordinary. I mean, it was a bit of a clash in the beginning. When I was there, you would have these young men with long hair and Birkenstocks, standing nose to nose with some military guy with, trying to, stop them from doing something or the other. There was a clash. But by and large, the military involvement was absolutely critical in being able to have a good response. So you do have a good response. You have a good response for the famine in Kenya some time ago, because of WFP had ships. You do have more and more, Emma, more and more you have examples of good response. You do. Yeah.
And the contrary. We should have done it the other way around to finish on a positive note, but no, but bad responses she asked about as well.
Oh, bad responses.
Like
No, everything else isn't bad responses.
Okay.
I'm
That's
just
great.
giving you the good ones.
Well, thank you very much indeed for being so generous with your time and answering. I would take on myself also to suggest that if 1 or 2 students are working in these areas, they could perhaps be in touch with you in the
Yes,
future.
of course, if I can be of help. Yeah.
Terrific. Okay, well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.